I thought what I would do, being with an international organization that has been wrestling with this issue of intervention, give you a sense of the process that Amnesty International went through to actually arrive at a position on armed intervention. Up until just 3 years ago, in fact, Amnesty's position was we have no position. We didn't take any, we didn't oppose or endorse armed intervention or the use of force. So it took a while for us to sort that out, and we don't have a policy. So I'm going to just take you through what that looked like, what it looked like for an international organization to come to some conclusion around our thoughts about intervention. And it starts with have a series of international meetings. We have every 2 years we have an international meeting of our members where they discuss resolutions around policy, whether Amnesty should do this or that, or not do this or that. And for quite a few times in a row, and these happen every 2 years, Amnesty had brought up this issue of armed intervention, but hadn't been able to actually wrestle it to the ground in a way that was a clear policy or was a change, and simply stuck with, we have no position. At the 2003 International Council meeting, the decision was made to launch, to do a study so that we could get a really clear sense of what it is we're talking about around armed intervention and what Amnesty's policy should in the end be. And with these kinds of these studies, it involves a lot of consultation with our membership around the world. And we have 2.2 million members, so there's different processes that reach down to our members, give them a chance to have input into what Amnesty's policy will be on this issue. And that process is started by the International Office issuing a paper which outlines what are the issues, what are the questions that we're asking our members to kind of wrestle with when it comes to thinking about intervention. So what are the key international standards we might look at? What's already happening out there in the world that we need to look at? What are the debates going on, both within Amnesty, which were very intense, as has been suggested already, also very intense out in the world. People, in lots of places, were debating the whole idea of armed intervention. The success and failure of UN peacekeeping operations as one type of intervention, and where military interventions, authorized or not authorized by UN Security Council, what the outcomes were of those kinds of interventions. And acknowledging that a lot of our members were very concerned, or very upset, in fact, that Amnesty, for example, hadn't called for armed intervention in the case of the genocide in Rwanda. That Amnesty, position was, no, we don't talk about armed intervention. So that was something that a lot of members were very dissatisfied with, that we hadn't been very proactive in calling for intervention. At the same time, members were also upset that Amnesty hadn't actively enough opposed what they considered an unwarranted or illegal and unjustified attack on Iraq in 2003. We had started to talk about the role of armed intervention. In fact, in mid-2003, we did call for the deployment of a rapid what we call a rapid reaction force in the DRC, where it was really clear that the ethnic militias were committing horrendous levels of human rights violations. And in one of our reports, there's quite a lot of detail about the fact that was and has been deemed quite a success in the end when it went through the UN Security Council, and they did put in a temporary force, because there was a larger force being planned, but we called for a temporary force because the larger force was going to take too long to assemble and be ready on the ground. So we asked our members to consider or to ask themselves a number of questions. Things like, will human rights be protected, or will we sort of save lives with intervention, or will an intervention make it worse? And we took our members through a whole variety of kind of fictional scenarios for them to kind of think about what it might look like and what the outcomes might be, and also how that was consistent or not consistent with current Amnesty policy or current ways of working in the world. And what kinds of policies we should develop around that if we were to go ahead and change our policy and actually have a position on intervention. This was followed by a second paper that Amnesty issued out of our international office a couple of months later in 2004, which started to present some of the actual options. So instead of being kind of ambiguous or general in terms of is it good or bad, we then had a paper that talked about what kinds of things what kind of dilemmas would Amnesty be kind of considering if it was looking at whether to go ahead with calling for armed intervention or calling for in opposition to an armed intervention. And what our role would be in the international community, would our voice be heard? Would it make sense for us to add our voice to that, those questions? And how could we make sure that we were consistent in terms of our long-time standing belief in the indivisibility of human rights? And how can we then say, well, armed intervention, which obviously always clearly does end up in human rights violations, how can we say that somehow those individuals being affected, their rights were somehow less than the rest of the population? But also looking at whether we would have time to make an appropriate kind of recommendation, whether there were adequate protections for women. 99% of the armed forces in the world are men, and that has quite an impact on the way women are treated in conflict. How do we determine or look at more closely the motives for intervention? As has been already suggested, often those motives are quite tainted. The idea that this is a humanitarian intervention hides or masks the fact that there are colonial, imperial motives at stake. And how do we make sure that we're not caught up in those kinds of interventions? And just the general militarization of society or of the world. We're really concerned about $1 trillion a year being spent on arms and military conflict, when such a small amount of that would actually go a long ways to doing a lot of the work to prevent these kinds of violations and conflicts in the first place. So we issued a number of papers that talked about all those kinds of questions we want our members to wrestle with. At their local meetings, at our regional meetings, and our national meetings. We had opportunities for our members to really think through all of those questions and many more that I couldn't list all of these. And eventually got to the point where Canada was then ready to make our presentation to, or our delegates at our international meeting in 2005 to indicate our Canadian members' concerns or interest in this. Just seeing if there's something else I wanted to mention about that. One of the things that we talked about in we had the options for our members to consider, but in the process, in a later paper, this is in the early 2005, we also started talking more about the issue of conflict resolution and conflict prevention, recognizing or realizing that perhaps there was a better role for Amnesty to talk and be more organized and coherent in our discussion and pushing for much more work internationally on conflict resolution and, in fact, conflict prevention. There's a lot of talk about humanitarian intervention forgets the fact that there could have been a lot of work done ahead of that around prevention, and that Amnesty had maybe a stronger role to play in terms of identifying that kind of discussion and really pushing it. And one of the things we did was working with Oxfam and the International Action Network on Small Arms, created the Control Arms Campaign, which campaigned very heavily for the establishment of an arms trade treaty. And through a series of UN resolutions, that treaty is now in development, and there is some hope that that will be in place in 2010. The final paper incorporated all of the input and concerns that our Amnesty members have and our staff had and sections had, and a final resolution went to our International Council meeting in August 2005. So exactly 2 years later, we had a proposal for the members that are assembled at that meeting. And those meetings involved about 450 Amnesty members from around the world selected to represent their sections. So we had 5 members from Amnesty Canada representing 4 from Amnesty in English-speaking and 1 from the Francophone section to vote on the final resolution. And so I'll just quickly give you the final resolution or the final wording, and then I'll leave it at that and carry on from there. I think that's almost my 5 minutes, or
almost.
Okay. Well, I didn't see anyone hold up a card, So
I'll start coughing.
Okay. That's very quick. Well, I'll say the position, which actually sounds very familiar to our old position, but there's a slight change. So our general position is that Amnesty International is an independent and impartial human rights organization that generally takes no position on desirability or otherwise of particular military interventions or other forms of armed conflict, other than the demand that all participants must respect international human rights law, or human rights and humanitarian law. And then there's a short section here, in exceptional circumstances. So that's where we've moved just out of our previous position into a list of exceptional circumstances, and maybe I'll leave that for the Q&A period.
Thank you very much,
Okay.
Sean.